everybody. So I've already put some videos, really podcasts, because it didn't include my face, out there, and I thought now I would just introduce myself a little bit. You can see my face, you can hear my backstory, and maybe that'll be nice for people if you decide to listen to the podcasts. And I may use video again with my face at some point, but I tend to maybe prefer to just have you hear my voice and keep my face to myself. But let me tell you a little bit about myself. So some people coming. Oh, by the way, the stripes. If you can see them, that's the webcam, and I think they look kind of cool, so I'm not worried about it. Anyway, so some people hearing my podcast will think, oh, she's quite a crazy lefty. Others will hear them and say, oh my gosh, right wing libertarian nut. So I think that probably speaks well of me. That people, think either because maybe I'm somewhere in the middle, or maybe I'm a little bit of each, or maybe I can be a mediator between the two, which is my ideal, I think. And I'll tell you why. So it's an interesting story. I've been actually considering writing a book called 360 Degrees of Politics or something, because I have almost pretty much gone around the entire circle. So I was raised by two people who both pretty much called themselves socialists. My father is an economist. He's not like a Marxist, but he sort of has been at times. He's definitely left of center, I would say, for an economist, which is interesting. He's more heterodox. Won't say too much more about that because I don't want to say the wrong thing. Because he's probably not super left wing. That's probably a wrong characterization. And if I tell you any more, I would have to use economics terms, which many people wouldn't even know, or name economists that people don't know. So let's just leave that. My mother, well, she used to have debates after my parents split with a roommate she was living with, because my mom was a Leninist and her roommate was a Stalinist. So that tells you a little bit something. She definitely considered herself socialist. Very, very sweet, very warm-hearted, very good person. Perhaps sometimes a little bit on the naive side of innocent. But best person you ever knew. I would say that, but it's true. Anyway, so I was raised that way, and I used to go to protests and stuff as a teen. But when 9/11 happened, I grew up just a few blocks from the World Trade Center, and it just completely shattered my world and my understanding of the world. Because I thought America was this great empire that couldn't be touched. And, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, it was a shock to a lot of people, I think, that something like that could happen. At least those of us who didn't have a strong, maybe, civics background. I went to a wonderful elementary school, but a lot of the schools I went to after that were not really big on the civics and the history and the kind of, understanding of what America was and how it was that way and what vulnerabilities it might have and why. So it was a complete and utter shock to me, and I decided at that time that I needed to learn more, that I needed to go back to university. Up till then, I had done mostly humanities kind of stuff, arts and literature and so on, and hadn't really, learned. I hadn't learned science, and I hadn't learned, as I say, politics, civics, history, and that kind of thing. So I did start out by going back for science because I thought, well, I want to learn facts. I want to learn something that is indisputable. But I quickly learned that I wasn't that interested in biochemistry and lab work, and I wasn't suited to it, and I was too impatient. And what I really cared about a lot more was economics and politics and policy. And so I ended up getting into economics, and one of the things that interested me was this, was my family right about being socialist? What did that mean? And I knew I'd heard about Lenin and Stalin, but I didn't know enough to know whether, they were good people or bad people. I'd heard different things, but I didn't really understand. So I decided to start learning about that. And I quickly learned that, Stalin was not a good guy. And that even under Lenin, a lot of bad stuff had happened. And I was like, how could my family like these people or call themselves socialists? So I went more deeply into it and more deeply into it. And I ended up spending many years really studying the Soviet Union from mostly the economics of the Soviet Union kind of perspective, and really just trying to understand what was this socialism, what did Marx say, and how is it implemented, and were they implementing what Marx said, and and just really trying to understand the economics of socialism. And I got deeply, deeply into it. I ordered all these books off of Amazon, and I still have a lot of them back there, but many, many more than this. Is just a little bit of my book collection. But really got deeply, deeply into the economics of socialism and beyond, and the original writings. Marxist.org. You can read all of that stuff online, so you don't need to get the physical books for all of Lenin's writings and Marx, but also many, many, many other Marxists. They're all on there. It's great, great resource. Anyway, so as I got into all of that, I learned about Austrian economics. It's an economics school. It's not really about Austria. There were a few of the founding fathers of Austrian economics were from Austria. That's where the name comes from. But you may have heard of Hayek. There's also Mises. There's Kirzner. There's all these, and Menger originally, and comes, well, I won't get into all the details, but the sort of marginalist revolution that created neoclassical economics. Actually, the Austrians were kind of part of that, but they also stayed with a kind of classical economics approach like Adam Smith and also Marx. They had this more classical approach and less mathematical. Anyway, not to get into that, but Austrian economics, they critiqued socialism very early on. There were some of the few economists who actually critiqued socialism even before, it was implemented. So I learned about that, and I got into them, and I thought, wow, these guys must know what they're talking about. They could see this ahead of time, whereas other economists couldn't. It seemed obvious to me when you look at the economics of it, but many, many economists, believed in the idea, even through into the 60s and so on, and just thinking, oh, you just got to perfect it. Maybe the wrong people were in charge, so on and so forth. A guy named Oscar Longe, he believed... And many of these people believed, that you just have to get it right. You just have to learn how to do the price system without markets. Just fake it. But what I learned is that markets are very important. The actual competition and the actual private property ownership is very important to produce prices which are needed to understand, to be able to distribute and to be able to allocate resources through an economy. So how much do you need to produce of something? What kinds of technology should be used to produce it? If instead you have government deciding, right, you can have, there's some terrible things that have happened recently. Like, so say we understand that maybe that oil is producing global warming. Maybe we all agree that we need to have, a renewable resource. Fine. Which one? What's going to work? And you had this horrible debacle where the government was subsidizing ethanol, and everyone thought this was a great idea, but all it did was it ended up taking away, the use. Nobody could buy corn anymore because the price was driven up because all of the corn was being used for ethanol. And it didn't even turn out to be efficient or good or anything. And people died because of this problem of the price going up. And that was because of this subsidy. And in that case, it doesn't even matter about the price, because if it was all a socialist system, it would have just meant there was no corn left for anyone to eat. You know what I mean? So there's this problem whether you have half government like that with subsidies or whole government like in the Soviet Union. It's just doesn't work. It's just terrible. And obviously you can go overboard and think that then government shouldn't be doing anything or shouldn't even maybe be subsidizing anything. And that's not necessarily the case. And this is something that's taken some time for me to come around. Like I said, there's this sort of 360 degrees, because at first, as I learned all of this, I thought, well, that means that you shouldn't subsidize anything, right? Because they're going to mess up the prices. They're going to, leave people starving without corn because it all goes to ethanol through subsidies. There are definite problems with it, which I describe all of these in my first book. This is after reading tons and tons of Soviet economics. And this is sort of rediscovering FIRE, meaning supply and demand, right? It was like a new, after getting so involved with Marxist economics that you didn't even know what supply and demand were anymore, or how they could create a market. right? Rub the supply and demand together until you spark a market. Anyway, but you can go overboard. It is possible for government to do some good things. It is possible where the market could fail. Now, market failure is a thing that's probably been way overused. Um, there are definitely problems with the way that it's used sometimes, but things like healthcare and other areas, there are problems where, I mean, you got to realize that not everyone is born in the same place, especially when you have historical inequities. I mean, if you go back a few generations, right, you had people who were slaves in America, and you had people later who created their own wealth and the sort of what they call the Black Wall Street, and then you had a massacre and they lost all of their wealth. And you have all of these problems where and banks wouldn't lend to people and so on and so forth, and so you have people starting off in completely different places from other people, and markets can't just solve all of that overnight, because markets depend on the idea that people have jobs, that people could potentially borrow money, that people have equal opportunity. And when you don't have equal opportunity because of these problems, markets can't just magically solve it. And people say, oh, markets can actually get rid of racism because, the people who treat everyone equally will do better than the people who are unwilling to hire black people or unwilling to sell to black people, say. But that's not necessarily true. If you have enough racism in an area, actually, the white people who have all of the money anyway will actually reward the company that decides to be racist, right? So, I mean, these things are complex. Markets are not perfect. They can't solve everything in the way that people might hope that they could, because it's just people, right? Governments is just people, and markets is just people, and all institutions and all of these things are just people, right? And so nothing is magic. Nothing's a magic bullet, a silver bullet. You all of these problems exist, and that also means that government isn't just the enemy and just evil. And this is something that is a problem. We've been divided into people who hate government and people that hate markets, or people that hate the left and people that hate the right. And this division is actually probably being created on purpose. All right. There's a thing called active measures. It's something the KGB used to use, but it's an intelligence agency technique, so it's not only the KGB probably that used it. Probably the CIA used it as well, right? And it actually existed way before either of those two organizations existed, right? It probably comes from the art of war, like thousands of years ago. These are old things, like divide and conquer, disinformation, sort of trying to destroy institutions so that you can then come in and take over. And these techniques of disinformation, of dividing people, of creating the idea that people have two different realities, two different ideas of facts, alternate facts and other facts, and all you have to do is get like half of the society to distrust each of these institutions, be it police, be it the FBI or whatever, be it schools, be it anything, doesn't matter. But you get one part of the population, at least, one half maybe, to completely not trust it. And then even though the other half trusts it, basically you've caused so much chaos and distrust between the two and people not knowing what to believe that you've essentially undermined the entire institution, right? So even if 50% of people still think it's great, it doesn't matter, because there's such division and some people totally don't believe it that it basically is practically ruined 100%, right? Because no one knows who to believe anymore. And this does seem to be what's happening in America right now. And that is the really dangerous, concerning thing for me. So my good friend was talking to me about active measures. He's got a website called peaceful.ly, peaceful.ly, and in his own podcast. And he's looking at active measures. And he's also creating a new tool that can help create actual reasonable debate. And that's called Concordis. Like Concord, Concordis.io. And it's really good. It's just for basically regular discussion and debate based on facts, based on, you have to like include a link and you can't include rhetoric. It's really kind of paring things down to something reasonable where two sides can actually talk to each other. I've always been into mediation. I had to do a lot of mediation as a kid between family members. And he, my friend, James Tolley, he's been doing mediation with couples counseling and things like that. So we're both interested in this idea of mediation, bringing two sides together, getting them to actually discuss and debate and use facts and logic. And one problem is that people don't, they tell you that your facts and your, evidence is from an unreliable source, it's fake news, whatever. I hope that with Concordis we can get past that, because if someone includes a link and let's say it's to the New York Times and the other person says that the New York Times is unreliable, fine. Well, what was the New York Times citing? Who is an expert who, they're using the knowledge of that person. Maybe they've written a study, or maybe they've done something, and maybe we can invite that person in to put their 2 cents in to tell us how they know this. And then that person can debate with someone else who says, no, I don't believe you. I think that it's something else. And then, you can try to get as close to the source as possible where people can actually tell you where their facts came from. So you don't have to trust the New York Times. You can get deeper and deeper. If there's not a study published online, still that person may be able to tell you who they spoke to, how they got their, their knowledge, their answers. And we can try to debate it out without even having to trust the same sources or the same fact checkers or the same, media outlets that people don't believe in, right? We can get past that and we can try to find truth together. So that's the hope, concordis.io. And yeah, so, like I said, I've sort of come around 360. I was raised socialist. I became very libertarian. I worked for the Heritage Foundation for 5 years. I ran an individual income tax model. They normally have someone with a PhD in that position, but I had been doing some really interesting modeling of markets using what's called agent-based programming, basically kind of like a simulation. And the guy who's running the Center for Data Analysis, which is where I worked for, he liked agent-based modeling. So I worked for them for 5 years, running their tax model, which also involved analyzing the results and writing up articles and so on and so forth. I've since come to a different position on it. I mean, it's a lot of it is about how you ask questions. Some of it is how you create your models. I do think a lot of the work that I did was very good, but I do wonder about their slants. And I do think in the age of Trump, they have lost some of the integrity that they used to have, to the extent that, I don't know if I agreed with them anyway, but I do think that they've gone against some of what they used to say they believed in. And I do think that's a big problem during the Trump era, is people have stopped being true to themselves and have started to be only team A, team B. And like I said, this is one of the active measures things, trying to get people to hate each other and to stick to one side, whether or not they believe it, just so they can support their team. It's like, two football teams, and it doesn't matter, I'm going to, it's like support you right or wrong. I'm going to support, my country right or wrong, or my team right or wrong. Doesn't matter if my team cheats, I'm still going to fight for them. And that's the wrong attitude, and it's very un-American. And we have done a lot in recent years that has been very un-American. The anti-immigration stuff seems very un-American. Violating the Constitution and defending the party and the people who have violated the Constitution just because that's our team seems very un-American, is very un-American. Anyway, I would like to see us all become more united, forget the teams, forget the crap, and just get back to being a good country who cares about human rights, individual rights, and can have an open and free dialogue with each other. And that's it. Thank you. And I hope you watch future podcasts.